A minute to smile and an hour to weep in, a pint of joy to a peck of trouble, and never a laugh but the moans come double. And that is life. A crust in a corner that love makes precious, with a smile to warm and the tears to refresh us. And joy seems sweeter when cares come after, and a moan is the finest of foils for laughter. And that is life. Good evening, friends, and welcome once again to Storytime for Adults. This is the first Storytime we've done in 2022, and as you may have guessed, it's going to be a bit more occasional this year, seasonally or bi-monthly as time allows. So tonight is February 28th. That makes today both the last day of African American History Month and Lundi Gras. Now, for those of you without a connection to Southern Louisiana, Lundi Gras is also commonly called Shrove Monday or Fat Monday, and is the day that precedes Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras, of course, means Fat Tuesday. It's the day of celebration and revelry before Ash Wednesday and the beginning of the Lenten season. Traditionally, Lundi Gras has been a day of rest, recuperation, and reflection between the parties of the weekend leading up to Mardi Gras and the day itself. Given them, these two unusually completely unconnected calendar events happen to fall on the same day, I thought I should go ahead and just make something out of that. So last year, Mardi Gras fell squarely within the month of February, and so as a result, we read some stories and poetry from a remarkable woman from New Orleans named Alice Dunbar Nelson. Well, tonight's author is not themselves a New Orleanian, but definitely has an important connection to the city, and is perhaps one of the most important Black American authors ever, and is certainly one of the most influential. So, who am I talking about? Tell you what, how about I read you one of his poems and you guess? No Googling, that's cheating. I know what the caged bird feels, alas, when the sun is bright on the upland slopes, when the wind stirs soft through the springing grass, and the river flows like a stream of glass, when the first bird sings and the first bud opes, and the faint perfume from its chalice steals. I know what the caged bird feels. I know why the caged bird beats his wing till its blood is red on the cruel bars, for he must fly back to his perch and cling, when he fain would be on the bough a swing, and a pain still throbs in the old scars, and they pulse again with a keener sting. I know why he beats his wing. I know why the caged bird sings, ah me, when his wing is bruised and his bosom sore, when he beats his bars and he would be free. It is not a carol of joy or glee, but a prayer that he sends from his heart's deep core, but a plea that upward to heaven he flings. I know why the caged bird sings. So, of course, the line, I know why the caged bird sings, is the title of Maya Angelou's 1969 autobiography. The title is taken from the first line of the third stanza of the poem Sympathy by the Black American poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, and I wanted you all to hear it in its full context. So that's tonight's author. This evening we'll be reading a couple more poems and a short story by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Last year we highlighted his wife Alice, who was a remarkable and important literary figure in her own right. Paul, however, was undeniably had a far more considerable influence on both American and world literature and poetry. So with all that in mind, let's talk a little bit about Paul, shall we? Paul Laurence Dunbar was born June 27th, 1872 in Dayton, Ohio. His mother, Matilda, moved to Dayton, Ohio from Kentucky with her two other young sons, Robert and William, from her first marriage after emancipation. You see, Matilda had been a slave. Paul's father, Joshua, had also been an enslaved man, but he'd escaped bondage to Kentucky before the Civil War ended, traveled to Massachusetts on foot, and volunteered for the 55th Infantry Regiment, the first of only two Black Army units to serve for the Union in the Civil War. Paul's father also served in the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry Regiment during the war. Though Joshua and Matilda's marriage would prove to be fraught, and they would end up separating after the birth of Paul's young sister, his father remained in his life as an active and important influence until his death when Paul was 13. Joshua's status as a veteran and all that meant and symbolized had a profound effect on Paul and how he viewed the United States and its relationship to its black citizens. Now, despite having never been formally educated, for obvious reasons, Paul's mother Matilda taught herself to read, largely so that she could assist in the education of her own children. She also went on to become a minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And the Methodist Church, in which Paul was raised, and Protestantism generally, proved to have a powerful effect on young Paul's worldview and thinking, as well as his love of literature and poetry. Now, here's where things get a bit unexpectedly interesting, at least for me. Paul attended high school in Dayton, Ohio's Central High School. Now, while there, he became not just acquaintances, but friends with two brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright. Yes, those Wright brothers, Kitty Hawk and the First Manned Flight. Yeah, he was also the only black student to attend Central High School in Dayton. Now, it's probably impossible for us to really imagine what that was like for Paul, to be the only black student at a school full of white pupils and the son of ex-slaves in the 1880s. And yet, whatever we might imagine it to have been like, Paul appears to have been very well liked and socially popular. He was elected the president of the Central High School Literary Society and elected the editor-in-chief of its school newspaper. And he was an active member of the school debate club. All this less than a quarter century after the end of the Civil War. And it's worth remembering that at this point, Paul was being raised close to the poverty line by a single parent. In the 1880s, Dunbar published his first poems, in the Dayton newspaper at age 16. At age 18, in 1890, he very briefly wrote and edited a weekly newspaper for African Americans in Dayton titled The Tattler. Interestingly, his publishers were his old high school friends, Orville and Wilbur Wright. The paper was extremely short-lived. It only lasted for about 6 weeks or so, but then all of those involved were in their late teens. Still a heck of an accomplishment, really. In 1891, he went on to work as an elevator operator, and in 1893, he self-published his first work of poetry, Oak and Ivy, which he sold all of his copies of within 2 weeks. Now, I do need to digress briefly and note here that Paul Dunbar became both notable and famous for his use of dialect language in both his fiction and poetry. It was by no means something that he used in all of his writing, but he was especially adept at it. He used lots of specific regional dialects that were very discernible even today in his writing. He serves as an exemplar of this style even today. So the second half of Oak and Ivy, the Ivy section, was written entirely in dialect and became very quickly recognized for its brilliance. This small, self-published book attracted the attention of the white American poet James Whitcomb Riley. Now, he himself wrote in dialect form in poetry and short stories, and was a huge advocate of dialect writing to express unique American culture, especially as it came to different regional areas, different ethnic groups. He was a huge advocate for it. Now, by 1896, Paul was having financial difficulty supporting himself and his mother on his writing. However, in that same year, he self-published his second work of poetry, Majors and Minors, which was glowingly reviewed by Harper's. Now, this brought Dunbar to the attention of a national audience, and it allowed him to move more freely into the writing of short stories and novels. Among the things he did was he actually also was one of the first black authors to cross the color line in his writing. That is, somebody who wrote more about white culture or would write certain stories that dealt with white culture and white society to the exclusion of black culture. It was actually something that his future wife, Alice, was also known for doing. So he ended up staying friends with the Wright brothers for the rest of his life, but he would also become acquainted with Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington through his literary endeavors. In 1897, Paul would end up going on a literary and speaking tour of the United Kingdom. While there, he corresponded extensively with Alice Ruth Moore, a school teacher from New Orleans that he'd met in 1895. Upon his return to America, the two eloped and were married in March of 1898. She, of course, took the name Alice Ruth Dunbar, and later in life, after a subsequent marriage, Alice Dunbar Nelson. Paul worked briefly for the Library of Congress, and while living in D.C., he attended Howard University for some time, but he left the library and the school to continue pursuing his own writings, at least partially at the urging of his wife. Everything would seem to have been ahead of him. Regretfully, in 1900, Paul Dunbar was diagnosed with advanced tuberculosis at the age of 28. Now, at that time, there was no cure for the disease, and it was typically fatal. Treatment usually consisted of fresh, clean air, physical rest, and prescriptions to deal with pain. In Paul's case, this entailed he and Alice moving to Colorado, where it was thought that the mountain air would help him, and a prescription to drink whiskey almost constantly for the pain. This was calamitous advice, and before long, Paul Laurence Dunbar, previously a thoughtful, loving, and doting husband, had become a physically abusive alcoholic. During one particularly bad argument in 1903, Paul beat Alice almost to death. At that point, Alice left him, though they did not divorce. Paul returned to Dayton, Ohio, to live with his mother, and he passed away on February 9th of 1906. He was 33 years old. Despite the ending of their relationship, his wife Alice, however, continued to be an outspoken advocate for his writing for the rest of her life. In fact, when she took up a role as a publisher in New York during the Harlem Renaissance, Paul's works, including some previously unpublished works that she had, were things that she enthusiastically reprinted. Thus, even though Paul had predeceased the Harlem Renaissance by 2 decades, he still managed to become an important part of it. So this evening, we're going to read, I think, 2 more poems by Paul Laurence Dunbar, as well as the short story, The Scapegoat. So, I've gone on long enough, I think. Let's go ahead and get into it, shall we? So let's see, how about a poem first, and we will bookmark the short story with 2 poems. First poem will be Ships That Pass in the Night. Out in the sky, the great dark clouds are massing. I look far out into the pregnant night where I can hear the solemn booming gun and catch the gleaming of a random light that tells me that the ship I seek is passing, passing. My tearful eyes, my soul's deep hurt are glassing, for I would hail and check that ship of ships. I stretch my hands imploring, cry aloud. My voice falls dead a foot from mine own lips. And but its ghost doth reach that vessel, passing, passing. O earth, O sky, O ocean, both surpassing. O heart of mine, O soul that dreads the dark. Is there no hope for me? Is there no way that I may sight and check that speeding bark, which out of sight and sound is passing, passing? All right. The next short story is The Scapegoat by Paul Laurence Dunbar. The law is usually supposed to be a stern mistress, not to be lightly wooed, and yielding only to the most ardent pursuit. But even law, like love, sits more easily on some natures than on others. This was the case with Mr. Robinson Asbury. Mr. Asbury had started life as a bootblack in the growing town of Cadgers. From this, he had risen 1 step and become porter and messenger in a barber shop. This rise fired his ambition, and he was not content until he'd learned to use the shears and the razor and had a chair of his own. From this, and a man of Robinson's temperament, it was only a step to a shop of his own, and a place where it would do the most good. Fully 1/2 of the population of Cadgers was composed of blacks, and with their usual tendency to colonize, a tendency encouraged and in fact compelled by circumstances, they'd gathered into one part of the town. Here in alleys and streets as dirty and hardly wider they thronged. It was in this place that Mr. Asbury set up his shop, and he won the hearts of his prospective customers by putting up the significant sign, Equal Rights Barber Shop. This legend was quite unnecessary, because there was only one race about to patronize the place, but it was a delicate sop to the people's vanity, and it served its purpose. Asbury came to be known as a clever fellow, and his business grew. The shop really became a sort of club, and on Saturday nights especially, was the gathering place of the men of the whole quarter. He kept the illustrated and race journals there, and those who cared neither to talk nor listen to someone else might see pictured the doings of high society in very short skirts, or read in the black papers how Miss Boston had entertained Miss Bluford to tea on such and such an afternoon. Also, he kept the policy returns, which was wise, if not moral. It was his wisdom, rather more than his morality, that made the party managers after a while cast their glances toward him as a man who might be useful to their interests. It would be well to have a man, a shrewd, powerful man, down in that part of the town, who could carry the people's vote in his vest pocket, and who at any time its delivery might be needed could hand it over without hesitation. Asbury seemed that man, and they settled upon him. They gave him money, and they gave him power and patronage. He took it all silently, and he carried out his bargain faithfully. His hands and his lips alike closed tightly when there was anything within them. It was not long before he found himself the big man of the district, and, of necessity, the town. The time came when, at a critical moment, the manager saw that they had not reckoned without their host in choosing this barber of the Black District as the leader of his people. Now, so much success must have satisfied any other man. But in many ways, Mr. Asbury was unique. For a long time, he himself had done very little shaving, except of notes to keep his hand in. His time had been otherwise employed. In the evening hours, he had been wooing the coquettish Dame Law, and wonderful to say that she had yielded easily to his advances. It was against the advice of his friends that he asked for admission to the bar. They felt that he could do more good in the place where he was. "You see, Robinson," said Judge Davis, "it's just like this. If you're not admitted, it'll hurt you with the people. If you are admitted, you'll move uptown to an office and get out of touch with them." Asbury smiled, an inscrutable smile. Then he whispered something into the judge's ear that made the old man wrinkle from his neck with appreciative smiles. "Asbury," he said, you are. Well, you ought to be white, that's all. When we find a black man like you, we send him to state's prison. If you were white, you'd go to the Senate." The man laughed confidently. He was admitted to the bar soon after, whether by merit or by connivance is not to be told. "Now he'll move uptown," said the black community. Well, that's the way with a colored man when he gets a start. But they did not know Asbury Robinson yet. He was a man of surprises, and they were destined to disappointment. He did not move uptown. He built an office in a small open space next to his shop, and there he hung out his shingle. "I will never desert the people who have done so much to elevate me," said Mr. Asbury. "I will live among them, and I will die among them." This was a strong card for the barber lawyer. The people seized upon the statement as expressing a nobility of an altogether unique brand. They held a mass meeting and endorsed him. They made resolutions that extolled him, and the black band came around and serenaded him, playing various things in varied times. All this was very sweet to Mr. Asbury, and the party managers chuckled with satisfaction and said, "That Asbury, that Asbury." Now there's a fable extant of a man who tried to please everybody, and his failure is a matter of record. Robinson Asbury was not more successful, but be it said that his ill success was due to no fault or shortcoming of his. For a long time, his growing power had been looked upon with disfavor by the black law firm of Bingo and Latchet. Both Mr. Bingo and Mr. Latchet themselves aspired to be black leaders and cadgers, and they were delivering Emancipation Day orations and riding at the head of processions when Mr. Asbury was still blacking boots. Is it any wonder, then, that they viewed with alarm his sudden rise? They kept their counsel, however, and treated with him, for it was best. They allowed him his scope without open revolt until the day upon which he hung out his shingle. This was the last straw. They could stand no more. Asbury had stolen their other chances from them, and now he was poaching upon the last of their preserves. So Mr. Bingo and Mr. Latchet put their heads together to plan the downfall of their common enemy. The plot was deep and embraced the formation of an opposing faction made up of the best blacks of the town. It would have looked too much like what it was for the gentlemen to show themselves in the matter, so they took into their confidence Mr. Isaac Morton, the principal of the colored school, and it was under his ostensible leadership that the new faction finally came into being. Mr. Morton was really an innocent young man, and he had ideals which should never have been exposed to the air. When the wily Confederates came to him with their plan, he believed that his worth had been recognized, and at last he was to be what nature destined for him, a leader. The better class of blacks, by that is meant those who were particularly envious of Asbury's success, flocked to the new man's standard. But whether the race be white or black, political virtue is always in a minority, so Asbury could afford to smile at the force arrayed against him. The new faction met together and resolved. They resolved, among other things, that Mr. Asbury was an enemy to his race and a menace to civilization. They decided that he should be abolished, but as they couldn't get out an injunction against him, and as he had the whole undignified but still voting black belt behind him, he went serenely on his way. "They're after you hot and heavy, Asbury," said one of his friends to him. "Oh, yes," was the reply. "They're after me. But after a while, I'll get so far away that they'll be running in front." "It's all the best people, they say." "Yes. Well, it's good to be one of the best people, but your vote only counts one, just the same." Time came, however, when Mr. Asbury's theory was put to the test. The Cadgerites celebrated the 1st of January as Emancipation Day. On this day, there's a large procession, with speech-making in the afternoon and fireworks at night. It was the custom to concede the leadership of the colored people of the town to the man who managed to lead the procession. For 2 years past, this honor had fallen, of course, to Robinson Asbury, and there had been no disposition on the part of anybody to try conclusions with him. Mr. Morton's factions changed all this. When Asbury went to work to solicit contributions for the celebration, he suddenly became aware that he had a fight upon his hands. All the better-class blacks were staying out of it. The next thing he knew was that plans were on foot for a rival demonstration. "Oh," he said to himself, "that's it, is it? Well, if they want to fight, they can have it." He had a talk with the party managers, and he had another with Judge Davis. "All I want's a little lift, Judge," he said, "and I'll make 'em think the sky's turned loose and is vomiting." The judge believed that he could do it. So did the party managers. Asbury got his lift. Emancipation Day came. There were 2 parades. At least there was one parade in the shadow of another. Asbury's, however, was not the shadow. It was the great deal of substance about it. Substance made up of many people, many banners, and numerous bands. He did not have the best people. Indeed, among his cohort were a good many of the pronounced ragtag and bobtail. But he had noise and numbers. In such cases, nothing more is needed. The success of Asbury's side of the affair did everything to confirm his friends in their good opinion of him. When he found himself defeated, Mr. Silas Bingo saw that it would be policy to placate his rivals' just anger against him. He called upon him at his office the day after the celebration. "Well, Asbury," he said, "you beat us, didn't you?" "Wasn't a question of beating," said the other calmly. "It's only an inquiry as to who were the people, the few or the many." "Well, it was well done, and you've shown that you're a manager. I confess that I haven't always thought that you were doing the wisest thing in living down here and catering to this class of people, when you might, with your ability, to be much more to the better class." "What do they base their claims of being better on?" "Oh, there ain't any use discussing that. We can't get along without you. We see that. So I, for one, have decided to work with you for harmony." "Harmony. Yes, that's what we want." "If I can do anything to help you at any time, why, you only have to command me." "I'm glad to find such a friend in you. Be sure if I ever need you, Bingo, I'll call on you. And I'll be ready to serve you." Asbury smiled when his visitor was gone. He smiled and knitted his brow. "I wonder what Bingo's got up his sleeve," he said. "He'll bear watching." It may have been pride at his triumph. It may have been gratitude to his helpers. But Asbury went into the ensuing campaign with a reckless enthusiasm. He did the most daring things for the party's sake. Bingo, true to his promise, was ever at his side, ready to serve him. Finally, association and immunity made danger less fearsome. The rival no longer appeared a menace. With the generosity born of obstacles overcome, Asbury determined to forgive Bingo and give him a chance. He let him in on a deal, and from that time they worked amicably together until the election came and passed. It was a close election, and many things had to be done. But there were men there ready and waiting to do them. They were successful, and then the first cry of the defeated party was, as usual, "Fraud! Fraud!" The cry was taken up by the jealous, the disgruntled, and the virtuous. Someone remembered how 2 years ago the registration books had been stolen. It was known upon good authority that money had been freely used. Men held up their hands in horror at the suggestion that the black vote had been juggled with, as if that were a new thing. From their pulpits, ministers denounced the machine and bade their hearers rise and throw off the yoke of a corrupt municipal government, one of those sudden fevers of reform that's taken possession of the town and threatened to destroy the successful party. They began to look around them. They must purify themselves. They must give the people some tangible evidence of their own yearnings after purity. They looked around them for a sacrifice to lay upon the altar of municipal reform. Their eyes fell upon Mr. Bingo. No, he was not big enough. His blood was too scant to wash away the political stains. Then they looked into each other's eyes and turned their gaze away to let it fall upon Mr. Asbury. They really hated to do it. But there must be a scapegoat. The god from the machine commanded them to slay him. Robinson Asbury was charged with many crimes, with all that he'd committed, and some that he'd not. When Mr. Bingo saw what was afoot, he threw himself heart and soul into the work of his old rival's enemies. He was of incalculable use to them. Judge Davis refused to have anything to do with the matter, but in spite of his disapproval, it went on. Asbury was indicted and tried. The evidence was all against him, and no one gave more damaging testimony than his friend, Mr. Bingo. The judge's charge was favorable to the defendant, but the current of popular opinion could not be entirely stemmed. The jury brought in a verdict of guilty. Before I'm sentenced, Judge, I have a statement to make to the court. It will take less than 10 minutes. Go on, Robinson, said the judge kindly. Asbury started in a monotonous tone, a recital that brought the prosecuting attorney to his feet in a minute. The judge waved him down and sat transfixed by a sort of fascinated horror as the convicted man went on. The before-mentioned attorney drew a knife and started for the prisoner's dock. With difficulty, he was restrained. A dozen faces in the courtroom were red and pale by turns. He ought to be killed, whispered Mr. Bingo audibly. Robinson Asbury looked at him and smiled, and then he told a few things of him. He gave the ins and outs, some of the misdemeanors of which he stood accused. He showed who were the men behind the throne, and still pale and transfixed, Judge Davis waited for his own sentence. Never were 10 minutes so well taken up. It was a tale of rottenness and corruption in high places, told simply and with the stamp of truth upon it. He did not mention the judge's name, but he had torn the mask from the faces of every other man who'd been concerned in his downfall. They'd shorn him of his strength, but they had forgotten that he was yet able to bring the roof of the pillars tumbling about their heads. The judge's voice shook as he pronounced sentence upon his old ally. A year in state's prison. Some people said it was too light, but the judge knew what it was to wait for the sentence of doom, and he was grateful and sympathetic. When the sheriff led Asbury away, the judge hastened to have a short talk with him. I'm sorry, Robinson, he said, and I want to tell you, you were no more guilty than the rest of us. But why did you spare me? Because I knew you were my friend, answered the convict. I tried to be, but you were the first man that I've ever known since I've been in politics who ever gave me any decent return for friendship. I reckon you're about right, Judge. In politics, party reform usually lies in making a scapegoat of someone who's only as criminal as the rest, but a little bit weaker. Asbury's friends and enemies had succeeded in making him bear the burden of all the party's crimes, but their reform was hardly a success, and their protestations of a change of heart were received with doubt. Already there were those who began to pity the victim and to say that he'd been hardly dealt with. Mr. Bingo was not of these, but he found, strange to say, that his opposition to the idea went but a little way, and that even with Asbury out of his path, he was a smaller man than he was before. Fate was strong against him, His poor, prosperous humanity could not enter the lists against a martyr. Robinson Asbury was now a martyr. 2. A year is not a long time. It was short enough to prevent people from forgetting Robinson, and yet long enough for their pity to grow strong as they remembered. Indeed, he was not gone a year. Good behavior cut 2 months off the time of his sentence, and by the time people had come around to the notion that he was really the greatest and smartest man in Cadgers, he was at home again. He came back with no flourish of trumpets, but quietly and humbly. He went back again to the heart of the Black District. His business had deteriorated during his absence, but he put new blood and new life into it. He did not go to work in the shop himself, but taking down the shingle that had swung idly before his office door during his imprisonment, he opened the little room as a news and cigar stand. Here, anxious, pitying customers came to him, and he prospered again. He was very quiet. Uptown hardly knew that he was again in Cadgers, and it knew nothing whatever of his doings. I wonder why Asbury is so quiet, they said to one another. It isn't like him to be quiet, and they felt vaguely uneasy about him. So many people had begun to say, well, he was a mighty good fellow after all. Mr. Bingo expressed the opinion that Asbury was quiet because he was crushed, but others expressed a doubt as to this. There are calms and calms, some after and some before the storm. Which was this? They waited a while, and as no storm came, concluded that this must be the after quiet. Bingo, reassured, volunteered to go and seek confirmation of his conclusion. He went, and Asbury received him with an indifferent, not to say impolite, demeanor. Well, we're glad to see you back, Asbury, said Bingo patronizingly. He'd variously demonstrated his inability to lead during his rival's absence, and was proud of it. What are you going to do? I'm going to work. That's right. I reckon you'll stay out of politics. What could I do even if I went in? Nothing now, of course, but I didn't know. He did not see the gleam in Asbury's half-shut eyes. He only marked his humility, and he went back swelling with the news. Completely crushed, all the run taken out of him, was his report. The Black District believed this too, and a sullen, smoldering anger took possession of them. Here was a good man ruined. Some of the people whom he had helped in his former days, some of the rude, coarse people of the low quarters, who were still sufficiently unenlightened to be grateful, talked among themselves and offered to get up a demonstration for him. But he denied them. No, he wanted nothing of the kind. It would only bring him into unfavorable notice. All he wanted was that they would always be his friends and would stick by him. They would to the death. There were again 2 factions in Cadgers. The schoolmaster could not forget how once at a time he had been made a tool of by Mr. Bingo, so he revolted against his rule and set himself up as the leader of an opposing clique. The fight had been long and strong, but it ended with odds slightly in Bingo's favor. But Mr. Morton did not despair. The 1st of January, an Emancipation Day approached. He arrayed his hosts, and the fight for supremacy became fiercer than ever. The school teacher brought the school children in for choir singing, secured an able orator and the best essayist in town. With all this, he was formidable. Mr. Bingo knew that he had the fight of his life on his hands, and he entered with fear as well as zest. He too found an orator, but he was not sure that he was as good as Morton's. There was no doubt but that his essayist was not. He secured a band, but still he felt unsatisfied. He had hardly done enough, and for the schoolmaster to beat him now meant his political destruction. He was in this state of mind that he was surprised to receive a visit from Mr. Asbury. I reckon you're surprised to see me here, said Asbury, smiling. I'm pleased, I know. Bingo was astute. Well, I just dropped in on business. To be sure, Asbury. What can I do for you? It's more what I can do for you that I came to talk about, was the reply. I don't believe I understand you. Well, it's plain enough. They say that the school teacher is giving you a pretty hard fight. Oh, not so hard. No man can be too sure of winning, though. Mr. Morton once did me a mean turn when he started the faction against me. Bingo's heart gave a great leap, and then stopped for the fraction of a second. You were in it, of course, pursued Asbury, but I can look over your part in order to get even with the man who started it. was true then, thought Bingo gladly. He did not know. He wanted revenge for his wrongs, and upon the wrong man. How well the schemer had covered his tracks. Asbury should have his revenge, and Morton would be the sufferer. Of course, Asbury. You know what I did innocently. Oh yes, in politics we're all lambs, and the wolves are only to be found in the other party. We're past that, though. What I want to say is that I can help you make your celebration an overwhelming success. I still have some influence down in my district. Certainly, and very justly, too. Why, I should be delighted with your aid. I could give you a prominent place in the procession. Oh, I don't want it. I don't want to appear in this at all. All I want is revenge. You can have all the credit, but let me down my enemy. Bingo was perfectly willing, and with their heads close together, they had a long and close consultation. When Asbury was gone, Mr. Bingo lay back in his chair and laughed. I'm a slick dude, he said. From that hour, Mr. Bingo's cause began to take on the appearance of something very like a boom. More bands were hired, the interior of the state was called upon, and a more eloquent orator secured. The crowd hastened to array itself on the growing side. With surprised eyes, the schoolmaster beheld the wonder of it, but he kept to his own purpose with dogged insistence, even when he saw that he could not turn aside the overwhelming defeat that threatened him. But in spite of his obstinacy, his hours were dark and bitter. Asbury worked like a mole, all underground, but he was indefatigable. 2 days before the celebration time, everything was perfect for the biggest demonstration that Cadgers had ever known. All the next day and night, he was busy among his allies. On the morning of the great day, Mr. Bingo, wonderfully caparisoned, rode down to the hall where the parade was to form. He was early. No one had yet come. In an hour, a score of men, all told, had collected. Another hour passed, and no more had come. Then there smote upon his ear the sound of music. They were coming at last. Bringing his sword to his shoulder, he rode forward to the middle of the street. And there they were, but could he believe his eyes? They were going in another direction. And at their head rode Morton. He gashed his teeth in fury. He'd been led into a trap and betrayed. The procession passing had been his, all his. He heard them cheering, and then, climax of infidelity, he saw his own orator go past in a carriage, bowing and smiling to the crowd. There was no doubt who'd done this thing. The hand of Asbury was apparent in it. He must have known the truth all along, thought Bingo. His allies left him one by one for the other hall, and he rode home in a humiliation deeper than he'd ever known before. Asbury did not appear at the celebration. He was at his little newsstand all day. In a day or two, the defeated aspirant had further cause to curse his false friend. He found that not only had the people defected from him, but that the thing had been so adroitly managed that he appeared to be in fault, and 3/4 of those who knew him were angry at some supposed grievance. His cup of bitterness was full when his partner, quietly ambitious man, suggested that they dissolve their relations. His ruin was complete. The lawyer was not alone in seeing Asbury's hand in his downfall. The party managers saw it too, and they met together to discuss the dangerous factor which, while it appeared to slumber, was so terribly awake. They decided that he must be appeased, and they visited him. He was still busy at his newsstand. They talked to him adroitly, while he sorted papers and kept an impassive face. When they were all done, he looked up for a moment and replied, "You know, gentlemen, as an ex-convict, I am not in politics." Some of them had the grace to flush. "But you can use your influence," they said. "I'm not in politics," was his only reply. And the spring elections were coming on. Well, they worked hard, and he showed no sign. He treated with neither one party nor the other. Perhaps, thought the managers, he's out of politics. And they grew more confident. It was nearing 11 o'clock on the morning of election, when a cloud no bigger than a man's hand appeared upon the horizon. It came from the direction of the Black District. It grew, and the managers of the party in power looked at it, fascinated by an ominous dread. Finally, it began to rain black voters, and as one man they voted against their former candidates. Their organization was perfect. They simply came, voted, and left. but they overwhelmed everything. Not one of the party that had damned Robinson Asbury was left in power, save old Judge Davis. His majority was overwhelming. The generalship that had engineered the thing was perfect. There were loud threats against the news dealer, but no one bothered him except a reporter. The reporter called to see just how it was done. He found Asbury very busy sorting papers. To the newspaperman's questions, he had only this reply: "I'm not in politics, sir." But Cadger's had learned its lesson. That was Scapegoat by Paul Laurence Dunbar. I do have one last poem that we'll be reading by Mr. Dunbar. This is actually one of his more famous poems. If you have heard of anything by him beyond sympathy, it is probably this poem. We Wear the Mask by Paul Laurence Dunbar. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but oh, great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet and along the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask. Well, hope you all have enjoyed Storytime. I would strongly urge you, if you found any interest in this, to seek out the poems and short stories of Paul Laurence Dunbar. Quite a lot of his short stories, especially those written in dialect, do an absolutely amazing job of capturing a sense of place in the way the characters speak. It's quite notable and a thing to behold. So I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and we will see you next time. Thank you.